Imagine being buried alive, not as punishment, but as the highest honor your society could bestow upon you. Now imagine that honor wasn't reserved for warriors or priests, but for the young women who served the emperor's table girls, barely past childhood, who were chosen not for their crimes, but for their beauty and their ability to pour tea without trembling. This was the reality in certain forgotten corners of the Ming Dynasty, where a practice so disturbing existed that even the official histories tried to scrub it from memory. They called it the ceremony of eternal service, and it was built on a belief so twisted it makes your skin crawl, that the emperor's favorite servants should follow him into death, not just symbolically but literally fully conscious to continue their duties in the afterlife. But here's where it gets truly horrific. These girls weren't simply killed and buried. No, that would be too merciful. They were prepared for weeks, sometimes months, through a process that slowly transformed them from living humans into what the court called breathing corpses. It started with their diet. Gradually, their food was replaced with a mixture of herbs, tree bark, and a special resin imported from the southern provinces that had mild preservative properties. The girls would grow thinner, their skin taking on a waxy, translucent quality as their bodies began to mummify from the inside out while they still drew breath. Court physicians monitored them daily, adjusting the mixtures to keep them alive but fundamentally changing their body chemistry. They would drink less water, their organs slowly shutting down in a controlled descent toward death. By the final week, these young women could barely speak, their voices reduced to whispers, their movements slow and dreamlike as if they were already ghosts. And the entire time, they were told this was an honor, that they were blessed among all women to serve their emperor beyond the veil of death. The ceremony itself took place in underground chambers beneath the Forbidden City, rooms that officially didn't exist on any palace map. When the emperor died, these prepared servants, sometimes as many as 20 girls, would be dressed in their finest silk robes and led down into the burial complex. But here's the part that historical whispers and leaked documents suggest happened next. They weren't killed before burial. Instead, they were given a final dose of the resin mixture, something that would slow their breathing to almost nothing, and then they were placed in small alcoves within the tomb walls. These alcoves were then sealed with a special quick-drying plaster mixed with ground jade, which the court believed had properties that could preserve and even extend life in some mystical way. The girls were positioned sitting upright, their hands arranged in poses of service, holding phantom teacups and invisible trays. Some accounts suggest they remained semi-conscious for hours, perhaps even days, in their sealed chambers, their slowed breathing gradually consuming the limited oxygen in their tombs. Archaeologists who've examined some of these burial sites in modern times, particularly one unauthorized excavation in the 1980s that was quickly shut down by the Chinese government, reported finding scratch marks on the inside of some sealed alcoves, fingernails broken and embedded in plaster. The official explanation was that these marks were from rodents or the settling of materials. But the researchers who were there, in leaked interviews years later, told a different story. They described finding remains positioned in contorted poses, nothing like the peaceful arrangement they should have been in, and residue under fingernails that matched the plaster seals. One researcher claimed they found evidence that some alcoves had small air holes, just enough to prolong consciousness but not enough to sustain life indefinitely. The girls would have been aware, trapped in darkness, feeling their breath grow shorter with each passing hour, hearing perhaps the muffled sounds of other girls in nearby alcoves going through the same slow suffocation. The psychological torture was the point. The court believed that suffering and sacrifice strengthened the spiritual bond between servant and master. The more these girls suffered in their final hours, the more powerful their service would be in the afterlife. Their terror and pain were offerings, their slow deaths a form of worship. And the most chilling part? This wasn't done to criminals or enemies. These were girls who had served faithfully, who had done nothing wrong, who had simply been unlucky enough to be beautiful and skilled and present when the emperor died. Families were told their daughters had been honored with eternal service, given a position of prestige in the afterlife court. Some families even celebrated, believing the propaganda that this was a blessing. The practice was officially banned in the 1500s, but whispers persist that it continued in secret for at least another century, hidden in the deeper traditions of certain imperial factions who believed the old ways held more power. But if you think being buried alive for your emperor was the worst fate ancient royal courts could offer, let me introduce you to the tasters of the czars, the men and women whose job was to eat the ruler's food first and then wait to see if they died. Sounds straightforward enough, right? Eat the food, survive or don't, simple job description. Except in the Russian imperial court of the 16 and 1700s, they took this concept and twisted it into something so psychologically devastating that tasters often went mad before poison ever touched their lips. See, the position wasn't just about taking a bite and moving on. The tasters, usually minor nobles who had fallen out of favor or prisoners with useful constitutions, were required to consume the exact same meal as the Tsar would eat, in the exact same quantities, and then they had to sit in a locked room called the Chamber of Confirmation for a minimum of 6 hours while court physicians monitored them for any signs of poisoning. But here's where the aristocratic sadism really shines through. The room had no windows, no furniture except a single chair, and the walls were painted with vivid murals depicting the symptoms of various poisons. Agonized faces with blackened tongues, bodies twisted in convulsions, skin covered in pustules and bleeding sores. The tasters would sit there, full of food, staring at these images, feeling every single twitch and gurgle of their digestive system, convinced that every minor discomfort was the beginning of an agonizing death. The psychological torture was deliberate. Court records from the era preserved in the archives in St. Petersburg that most historians conveniently ignore describe how tasters would begin screaming that they were poisoned, even when they weren't, their minds so broken by fear that they would experience psychosomatic symptoms. They would vomit, develop rashes, their hearts would race, all from pure terror, not actual poison. And here's the twisted part. When this happened, when a taster claimed poisoning, but the physicians couldn't confirm it, the taster would be punished for false alarm. The punishment: they would be fed a small amount of actual poison, not enough to kill, but enough to make them violently ill, so they would learn the difference between real poisoning and imagined symptoms. So these people were being poisoned for not being poisoned, a level of bureaucratic cruelty that feels almost satirical, except it was horrifyingly real. Some tasters lasted months, their mental state deteriorating with each meal, jumping at shadows, refusing to sleep, developing elaborate superstitions about which foods were safe based on color or temperature or the position of the sun. Others broke immediately, begging to be executed outright rather than endure another session in the Chamber of Confirmation. And the czars knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't just about safety. It was about power, about reminding everyone in the court that life and death, sanity and madness were entirely at the ruler's discretion. But the practice had an even darker evolution in the 1700s under Tsar Ivan the Unmerciful, a nickname that should tell you everything you need to know. Ivan decided that tasters weren't suffering enough, weren't truly invested in their work, so he implemented what court records called the Family Assurance Program. Tasters would no longer be lone individuals. Instead, entire families would be designated as tasting families with the understanding that if the taster failed to detect poison and the Tsar became ill, the taster's entire family would be executed in front of them before they themselves were killed. Children, elderly parents, spouses, everyone. This meant tasters would bring their families to live in special quarters near the kitchens, and these families knew that their lives depended on their relatives' ability to detect poison, or more accurately, their willingness to die first if poison was present. Can you imagine the family dynamics? Children growing up knowing their father's meal could mean their death. Wives watching their husbands eat with a mixture of love and resentment. the taster himself carrying the weight of everyone he loved with every single bite. Some families developed their own rituals, prayers spoken before each meal, last words prepared and memorized just in case. The quarters where these families lived became known as the corridors of the condemned, and the psychological atmosphere was so toxic that suicide rates were astronomical. People would rather kill themselves than live with that level of sustained terror. And here's something that'll really make your stomach turn. The position was hereditary. If a taster died from poison or natural causes, their eldest child would automatically inherit the position. Families were trapped in this nightmare for generations, creating dynasties of fear where parents would pray their children died young rather than grow old enough to take on the family curse. The practice wasn't officially abolished until the late 1700s, but even then, the psychological damage lingered. Descendants of taster families, even generations removed, showed higher rates of anxiety disorders, paranoia, and what we would now recognize as PTSD, all inherited trauma from a practice so cruel it poisoned bloodlines without ever using actual poison.